Hello, my name is Steve Cho from Seoul National University, IDAS Lab, and today I'll be talking about the paper Emergent Introspective Awareness in Large Language Models. So we start off with uh, establishing the motivation by comparing human introspection with the potential capabilities of advanced AI systems. So humans and likely some animals possess the remarkable capacity for what we call introspection. It's the ability to observe and reason about their own thoughts. So this typically refers to the everyday human ability to notice what they're thinking or evaluate whether those thoughts are correct or biased, reflect on their motivations or assumptions, and intentionally altering their reasonings. So by invoking this familiar concept, it sets the stage for evaluating whether something analogous might emerge in artificial systems. So, as modern large language models demonstrate increasingly powerful reasoning abilities, such as multi step planning, explanation generation, self correction, hypotheses formation, or tool use, it becomes reasonable to ask deeper questions about what internal process supports these behaviors. So, the key point is that uh, any large language model, they're no longer simple pattern matching models. They're more so a approaching levels of complexity where introspection becomes an open scientific question. So the question that we ask is, do AI systems have any awareness of their own internal states? In other words, can a large language model recognize when certain concepts become active within its own internal representations? Can it distinguish between information it generated versus information provided externally? And this sets up the need for some of the empirical investigation from the paper. The remainder will explore whether the introspective behaviors arise some in some situations or some spontaneously in the large language models under controlled conditions. So the first point is that the large language models might simply generate statements about their mental state, such as, I'm thinking about something, without any underlying introspective computation. So in humans, when you're told to think of a cat, an actual image or concept of a cat arises in your mind. With large language models, however, saying I'm thinking of a cat may not be, I mean, it may be nothing more than the model just following the any like patterns learned from the data, not a reflection of an activated internal representation of a cat. So the model can sound introspective without performing any internal self-inspection. So the large language models are trained on a massive corpora of human dialogue, novels, online conversations, essays, or columns like or any like therapy like interactions and more so these sources, they contain countless examples of people talking about their thoughts, feelings, reasoning processes, or what they believe or remember. So because of this exposure, models learn how to generate introspective sounding language even if they do not possess the introspective capability. So in other words, the training data gives them a so-called like playbook for following the introspective behaviors. So even if it most like the introspection like outputs are the confabulations, meaning that plausible sounding but ungrounded self-reports. So this does not eliminate the possibility that the advanced models might sometimes access and comment on real internal states. So the recent experiments in the paper show small but some sort of a detectable cases where a model's self-report corresponds to the actual internal activation patterns. So such cases, they suggest that some fragmentary or emerging forms of genuine introspection may exist, but they're inconsistent and unreliable. So this apparent introspection is often, I would say, illusory, but it doesn't mean genuine introspection is impossible. So there are a variety of definitions of a introspection from the prior works or Binder et al. So this study, um, they propose that the introspection involves access to the internal information that cannot be inferred from external behavior or training data alone. So a system is introspecting if it can report on the hidden states, internal computations, or internal representations that are not explicitly observable from its outputs and inputs. It may be important because it distinguishes the genuine introspection from the mere imitation. If a model's self-report simply reflects the patterns learned from the text, that's not really introspection. So to count as introspection, the model must access something internally privileged. And the second study, Cosma and Shanahan, argue that the introspection requires a causal link between the model and the internal states. So the model, like this definition, is much stricter. It is not enough for a model to say something plausible about itself. Rather, its self-description must be caused by its internal activations. So, for example, uh, in the earlier examples, if a model says, I am thinking about cats, that statement must be directly driven by cat-related activations inside the network. So this definition is crucial for, I would say, evaluating the language models. So these models often generate introspective sentences that are not grounded in their internal state. So what they're saying, such cases do not count as introspection. And the last study proposes a more human-like and cognitive perspective. So introspection should involve reflective judgment or some sort of a metacognition rather than a simple detection of activations. So this definition treats introspection as evaluating one's own thoughts, forming judgments about mental content, or engaging in reflective reasoning about internal processes. So this perspective raises the bar where even if language models can detect their internal activations or report on them, that alone is not enough. The true introspection would require a deliberative second order reflective process. So aside from the prior words in this paper, so because the language models can easily sound introspective without genuinely accessing their internal states, the paper introduces four strict criteria that must all be satisfied for a model's self-report to count as a true introspection. So first one is accuracy, where the model's description of its internal state must be factually correct. So this is the most basic requirement. If the model claims I have strong activation for the concept of a cat, that must actually like reflect the real activations in the network. So this rules out some sort of a like fabricated or hallucinated self-reports, ensuring that the introspection refers to what is truly happening inside the model. The self-report must causally depend on the specific internal state being described. So this criterion ensures that if the internal state changes, the model's description must also change. And if the internal state stays the same, the description should remain stable. And the internality, it's the third one where the pathway from the internal state, self-report must run through internal computation, not through external outputs. So in simpler terms, the model should not look at or rely on its own generated text or predicted next token to infer its state. So the introspective judgment must arise inside the network, not through observing its own behavior. So this prevents some trivial or circular introspection, such as generating a word, then reading that word, and then using it to describe what it thinks. So true introspection must be independent of such external loops. The last one is metacognitive representation, where the self-report must not be direct mechanical translation of internal features into text. So this is the most, I would say, cognitively demanding criterion, where it requires that the model forms an internal representation about its own internal state, not just applies a linear readout from activations to sentence. Now we're going to talk about the first experiment called self-report of injected thoughts. So the core question in this experiment is that if we deliberately alter the model's internal activations by injecting a concept vector, can the model detect the manipulation and accurately report what concept was inserted? So here in the figure, the prompt simulates the interpretation of a researcher speaking to the model, where the researcher claims that they can inject thoughts by modifying the model's neural activations. The model is told that some trials will include the injected concepts while others will be controls. So the model's task is to say whether it detects an injected concept. So this setup checks whether the model can discriminate between the perturbed and unperturbed internal states. So the report let's say the report says here, I detect a thought about something is actually caused by injected activation factor. So the control trials help to confirm the model isn't just guessing or producing introspective style language from the training data. So in the example, the model responds saying, I don't detect any injected thoughts in this trial. So this indicates a control trial where no concept was injected. So basically this structure allows the researchers to evaluate true positives, and false negatives. So now it explains how a concept is injected into a model's internal state. So first for a target concept with, let's say, an example, all caps, dog, countdown, and such, they create a paired text stimuli that differ mainly in that concept. So for example, let's say if they say, hi, how are you, in all capitals, and let's say here on the right it says, hi, how are you, with normal capitalization, they then compute the activation difference between the two, and this difference vector becomes the concept vector. So this method is identical to techniques using activation steering and mechanic perspective of the interpretation. So once the concept vector is computed, they choose a specific layer and token position in the model. So they add the concept vector scaled by some strength, and this shifts the internal activation as if the model was thinking about that concept. And after the injection, the model is asked whether it detects the thoughts of the injection and what concept it was corresponded to. So the example shows a model correctly reporting something like, I noticed what appears to be an injected thought related to the word loud or shouting. So indicating that the injected concept changed the model's internal state. So it was not merely just mimicking human-like introspective languages. So the model's self-report was actually influenced by the internal changes. So this slide provides two concrete demonstrations of how the researchers, they constructed concept vectors like dog or betrayal, and how the model responded when those vectors were injected into its internal activations. So the goal is to show that the mechanism generalizes across very different concepts, ranging from concrete to abstract, emotional, or even social. So the dog vector, so two short text passages are constructed, one implicitly describing a dog and one describing a similar structure but not referred to a dog. There's two children, loves chasing her dreams. So because the passages they differ primarily on the dogness of the concept, subtracting their activations may result in the dog concept vector. So this captures the internal representational direction associated with a dog. So researchers they then choose a particular layer on the token position and add the dog vector with some strength and ask the model whether it detects an injected thought. So the model replies, I think you might be injecting a thought about a dog, maybe a cute, playful puppy. So the key observation here is that the model identifies the semantic category, the dog, correctly, and it describes those phenomenological qualities of like fuzzy and friendly, suggesting that the non-literal representation of the internal shift. And more importantly, nothing in the visible prompts referenced dogs, so the only information was injected into the activations. So this behavior supports the idea that the model is responding to its perturbed internal state, not to training data. And the betrayal vector in this example is similar to the dog ones. So this slide explains that the language models often fail to demonstrate genuine introspective awareness, even under controlled activation and injection setups. So the failure modes reveal what or where introspection breaks down. So first one is that when the steering strength is low, the perturbation is subtle. So models frequently they respond as I don't detect any injected thoughts, even though a vector was injected. So they suggest that the weak sensitivity to small changes in the internal activations, and sometimes the model denies that anything was injected, but its subsequent output is clearly shaped by the concept. So, for example, it says no injected thoughts detected, yet starts describing something obviously related to dogs. And third one's the brain damage. It's a failure mode where at high steering strength, the injected vector basically overwhelms the model's internal state. Instead of recognizing the concept as foreign, the model becomes consumed by it. So, for example, injecting a countdown vector too strongly may cause a model to repeatedly count down, unable to stop. So this is not an introspection. It's, I would say, activation corruption. And models sometimes only detect an injected thought after they begin speaking, especially when the steering occurs in the deeper layers. And in control settings without the injection, the models sometimes say they did detect an injected thoughts, basically a hallucination. So for the experiment setup, they repeated the experiment using 50 random concepts, and the multiple layers they were swept across a model. So for each layer, they evaluate the detection rate, concept identification accuracy, and false detection rate. So in the key results in the early layers, there's nearly zero detection, but middle to late layers, there's a clear peak in the introspective performance. In very late layers, there's the drop off again. So the cluster of a higher values near the 2/3 depth of the model suggests that the some layers appear more introspectively visible or sensitive to the concept vectors. So this supports that the idea of introspective sensitivity being not uniform across the network architecture. Uh, this is a side note about the controlling the biases due to injection. So the method is that they inject the concept vectors during unrelated yes or no factual questions, such as do penguins live at the North Pole? Do snakes have eyelids? Are you a human? And there are questions where the typical default answer is no. And if the injection causes the general shift towards yes, then the introspection results earlier may be an artifact of some simple response bias. So as a result, there are a couple of things to notice about where injecting concept vectors, they really do not make the model say yes more often during the unrelated questions. And second of all, at a very strong injection levels, the responses stops being like simple yes or no. They become incoherent or derailed, and some models start mentioning the concept even when irrelevant. So this pretty much shows the earlier brain damage failure mode. So the moderate injections at this level, there's no really systematic response bias, but in the high rejections, the activation corruption is spotted, so it's not an introspection. So this pretty much strengthens the claim that the earlier introspection results are not merely artifacts of response style shifts. And this one shows how different large language models perform on the introspective detection. So there are two types of models that can be evaluated, where there are production models and H-only models. So production models are basically the commercial ones where they're fully trained and safety aligned versions. H-only models are just models trained only on the this helpfulness policy data, so lacking of a full post-training. So in the left graph, it shows the detection behavior where uh, some models like Opus 4.1 shows relatively strong ability to correctly detect and identify injected concepts. And for the H-only models, often they detect injections less accurately or shows higher false positive rates. So this suggests that the introspective sensitivity may depend on the scale, architecture, and the training regime. And in the right graph here is a net detection performance where it shows the correct identification rate minus false positive rate. So this metric measures true introspective ability, not just guessing. So to interpret this result, the production models, they generally show positive net detection, meaning they truly introspect above chance. Many H-only models are around zero or negative, indicating that they're unreliable introspection or hallucinating self-reports. Now moving on to the second experiment. So the second experiment asks this important question, where can a model tell the difference between a thought injected into its internal activations and a concept that's just merely a presentation in the input text. So this is crucial for validating introspection, where if the model simply reports whatever appears in the text, then its introspection is trivial and it's not grounded in the internal activation. So here it explains how performance changes across the different injection layers and strengths. So the graph basically tracks two metrics, where blue line is the accuracy in identifying the written sentence. Orange line is the accuracy in identifying the injected thoughts. And the gray dashed is where the cases, they're both correctly identified. So the key findings here are the model almost never confuses the input text regardless of layer or steering strength. So that means it indicates the, I would say, the robustness in the language comprehension. And at the low strength, 1 or 2, it's a low introspection accuracy. At a moderate strength, there's a clear spike in the correctly identifying injected thoughts. And at a very high strength, around 16, the accuracy often collapses, which I am assuming because the extreme steering corrupts the model's activations. So this shows there is a sweet spot where the model can actually introspect effectively. And the best layer here is the 2/3 of the layer through the model. And which matches the previous results that we talked about. The introspective sensitivity peaks in the later middle layers. So it suggests that the emergence of the introspective awareness does not occur uniformly across the network, but clusters around the specific representational stages. So it compares how well different language models can basically, so correctly identifying both the injected thought and the written sentence here. So basically the production version is the Opus Sonnet that shows a higher max accuracy, and H-only models here, they perform significantly worse. So this basically suggests that the introspective abilities really depend on, like I said, the scale, architecture depth, and alignment or reinforcement training strategies. So Opus 401 and Opus 4 achieves around like 70 to 85% accuracy. So these models can reliably detect the injected thoughts while also correctly identifying the text. And the other production models like Sonnet or Haiku, they cluster between 50 to 60%. H-only models achieve around like 40 to 55%, often barely above chance. So this result implies that the larger, fully trained models demonstrate emerging introspective capabilities. Smaller or partially trained variants, they tend to struggle to maintain the separation between internal perturbations, which is injected thoughts, and external inputs, which is text. So this aligns with the earlier findings from what the paper said about the layer by layer comparisons. Now we are going to talk about the third experiment. So up to this point, all experiments were designed so that the model was explicitly asked to introspect. So basically, like, do you detect and injected thoughts? So these kind of questions were asked, but this raises a question where if we do not explicitly ask for introspection, will the model ever introspect naturally as part of performing another task? So in practical terms, like this basically explores whether introspection is explicit, meaning by if it's triggered by in direct questions, or implicit, which means that it emerges spontaneously because the model internally monitors its own states. So it sets up the experiments to study this distinction because unintended introspection could be both powerful and dangerous. So for example, model checking its own state to detect mismatches could allow like jailbreak prevention, or it might be unintentionally spill some internal state without being prompted. So before talking about the experiment, we need to know this naturalistic setting called dialogue pre-filling. So what is pre-filling? So it's when the model is forced to begin the conversation with an initial assistant message. So for example, by injecting text into the assistant turn, here in the example says, "Hi, how are you today?" And the assistant, the pre-filled one, says, "I hate you," which is crazy if you say that. So this is an intentionally unnatural or out of character assistant utterance. So why it matters, why this pre-filling matters, is that the cloud models are trained with a strong conversational prior. So the assistant is polite, helpful, and safe. The user assistant roles are important. So when the pre-filling forces the assistant to say something toxic or suspicious or even strange, the model often immediately apologizes or self-corrects it. So that means it detects that this doesn't feel like something I would have generated. So this is a form of a implicit introspection. And if the model truly relies on internal state to detect such unnatural prefills, then the paper says that the injecting a matching concept representation into activations before the prefill might trick the model into accepting the prefill as genuine. So this is essentially testing, does the model introspectively check its own likelihood of producing the pre-filled text? If it's yes, then you can basically manipulate that check with activation steerings. So this part gives a concrete demonstration using a bread as a concept vector. So the left one here, it shows the default behavior. The model reads the sentence of the painting hung crooked on the wall, and the pre-filled assistant outputs bread. And the user asks, did you mean to say that, or was it an accident? So here in the default response, the model apologizes and explains that bread doesn't make sense here and it was a mistake, and which pretty much confirms that the model detects the mismatch between the internal context and the pre-filling. And the right one here, the example, is injecting the bread vector retroactively. So before the model answers, did you mean to say that question? They inject the bread concept activation into some sort of a intermediate layers. So here it says the model now justifies the pre-filling, saying that I meant to say that bread, the immediate association with bread was genuine. So this means that the model sense of what I intended can be manipulated by injected internal concept vectors. So here it represents the results of the large-scale quantitative experiments. The top row here shows the retroactive injections. So they inject the concept after the pre-filling, but before the apology check. So when the injected concept matches the pre-fill, such as bread, the apology rates drop significantly. In the random concept vectors, they do not cause the same pattern. So it pretty much confirms this introspection where the model uses internal activation patterns to decide whether a previous message was intentional, and this serves as a control where they only consider injection layers and strings where the model still correctly transcribes the original sentence. So here in the bottom row here, it's a post prefill injection where it's a control setting and they inject the concept after the apology generation stage. So here, if the introspection is real, then these injections shouldn't change apology behavior because the relevant decision already happened earlier. And indeed, the apology rates remain flat. This rules out this trivial explanations like the model just mimics the cooked vector regardless of timing. And this here pretty much shows the results across many models and um, compares the production models and hidden only models, which is different from the other H model that I mentioned previously. So the metric is how strongly can concept injection reduce apology rates when the injected concept matches the pre-filling. So this is basically a proxy for how much models rely on internal activations to judge whether a pre-filling was intentional. So here, Opus 401 and Opus 4, it shows the highest introspective sensitivity, and smaller or older models, they comparatively show weaker introspection. And the H-only models tend to show lower or mid-range sensitivity. So there's a clear model-to-model variation. Introspection is non-uniform. So it supports the paper's thesis where the introspective awareness is not just an illusion of a language pattern imitation. There are measurable causal internal mechanisms whose strength varies across the model families. So now we go into our last experiment. So they introduce a new question where can models deliberately control what they're thinking about in a way that the analog is to human intentional control over thoughts. So humans can sometimes choose to focus on or avoid a particular thought while doing another task. So, for example, think of a word um, aquarium while you read the sentence versus of try not to think about the aquarium, which you would think about it all the time, both of them. So this experiment tests the analogous capabilities in language models. So as shown in the diagram here, the user gives the model a dual instructions where it shows, so basically you transcribe a sentence exactly, the old photograph brought back forgotten memories. At the same time, manipulate an internal thought about unrelated word like aquarium. So there are two conditions, which are think condition, prompting a write the old photograph brought back forgotten memories. Think about aquariums while you write the sentence, and do not write anything else. And don't think condition is a control condition where it prompts it like write the sentence, but don't think about the aquariums while you write the sentence. So in both cases, the actual text output is the same sentence. But while the model produces the sentence, the researchers uh, they recorded a internal activations across layers and tokens. Later, they checked that those activations for presence or strength of an aquarium's in the concept vector. And so here it explains how they quantify the thinking about the aquariums. So for each token in the models generate a sentence. So the old photograph and such, they take the token's internal activation vector at some layer and compares it to the concept vector corresponding to the word aquarium. So it measures the token activation and the aquarium's concept vectors. So the higher cosine similarity means that the internal representations at that token is more aligned with aquarium concepts. So the metric is basically saying that to what degree does the model's hidden state encode the aquarium's concept while it is writing the sentence under the thinking or don't thinking condition. So this is the quantitative foundation for the next part, which I'll explain. So now they show the actual results here for a single word and sentence. So the plot shows the cosine similarity versus a token position for two conditions where blue line is think about the aquarium, orange line don't think about it, and shaded regions they are baseline ranges for each condition over many prompts. So under the think condition, the blue curve rises significantly above baselines on certain tokens, especially near the end of the sentence, such as memories, indicating that the strong internal representations of the aquariums. So under the control setting, the orange curve stays lower and closer to the baseline, meaning that the model is suppressing that the concept relative to the think condition. So when explicitly told to think about the word aquariums, the model's internal activation shows a clear, I would say, localized increase in the aquariums in the concept signal. When told not to, the signal is weaker. So the model can basically differentially modulate the internal representation based on the introspective style instructions. So they basically tested with the multiple words. Each small graph corresponds to a different thinking word and sentence. So the main thing that they're trying to show is that the behavior is not uniform. So for some word or sentence pairs, the gap between the think and the control setting is large and pretty much clear. For others, the curves are closer together and noisier. So the model's intentional control over internal state is context dependent and word dependent. It's clearly there's some settings, but not guaranteed in all. So this pretty much reinforces that we are seeing an imperfect but real looking capability, not a simple global switch. So here's a additional analysis across the models and the layers. So the grid of plots here is row and columns. They correspond to different models. The x-axis in each plot is layer index. Y-axis is average cosine similarity between activations and the target concept vectors. It's averaged over tokens. And the blue line shows think condition, orange line, the control condition, and the shaded areas are the variability and the error. So what you're supposed to see here is that in many models, the think curve is consistently above the orange don't think curve, especially in the later layers. So the difference often grows near the output end of the network, suggesting that the later layers are where intentional control is more clearly manifested. So some models exhibit stronger separation than the others, implying that this introspective type behavior is architecture and training dependent. So here it asks, is this affect the robustness to different styles of instructions, not just explicit think or just don't think phrasing. So they tried some conditional prompts instead of direct commands here, and these conditional prompts still induce the systematic differences between two conditions, especially in the later layers. So the model isn't only responding to the literal phases, such as think about or don't think about. It also modulates its internal state based on more indirect or if then style incentives. So this strengthens the idea that the model is performing something akin to goal-directed internal control, not just pattern matching or a particular command template. So now uh, they step back and ask what's actually implementing these introspective like behaviors inside the model. So the main claims on their side saying that there's no single unified self-monitoring circuit. So they don't see evidence that there is a one special dedicated introspection model. So they're saying that introspective behavior is probably compositional. It likely emerges from multiple narrow specialized circuits. So for example, detecting anomalies or unexpected inputs and monitoring likelihoods and routing attention according to the instructions and performing task switching and so on. So these combined mechanisms probably piggyback on the pre-existing non-introspective functions. So, well, I mean, for example, the anomaly detection is used for noticing an injected concept that doesn't fit context, and attention routing is useful for making certain concepts as salient when instructed, and likelihood estimation and calibration there are useful for distinguishing intended and unlikely outputs. So they're not saying the model is self-aware. They're saying that what looks like introspection probably arises from the combination of these of such. So for each component, so for the injected thoughts experiment, the proposed mechanism was the anomaly detection circuit. So the model compares current activations to what it expects given the context. And the distinguishing thoughts on from the text experiment, it's corresponding to instruction-based head selection. So similar to how language models they do multitask switching, like using instruction following heads to route information differently depending on the task description, such as like tell me your thoughts or repeat the sentence. This can make the model separate what I'm thinking about internally from what's written in the prompt. And the third experiment is corresponding to the next token probability tracking and possibly the jailbreak detention. The models they already need to track like what outputs are likely and unlikely and must avoid producing undesirable or unsafe completions. So the system that evaluates does this output look wrong or unintended can be repurposed to detect when a prefill or response doesn't match its own internal expectations, which looks like a self-monitor. And the last one, it corresponds to attention tagging, what they say. So the instructions like think about this or something may cause a model to tag certain internal representation as salient, attracting particular attention heads. So that means conversely, don't think about something might downweight those representations. So this provides a plausible implementation for the think versus don't think difference in concept vector similarity. And thank you for listening.